Hey, what's going on, good people? Baddest Chapman here once again, hoping all is well with you and yours. And today we have a very incredible guest. I've admired her work for a long time. I feel like I've been reading your work for over a decade now, and it's just so brilliant. Just here with the incredible writer Jamilah Lemieux. Jamila, it's wonderful to see you. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me.
For sure. No, thank you for being here. And I'm excited to talk about your upcoming book, Black Single Mother. I've read it described as a personal meditation and an examination of and a tribute to Black single motherhood. It's unapologetically being told through poignant essays and candid interviews. So, talk with us. What inspired you to undertake this book project and say, this is the time for it?
I'd wanted to write a book for years and I couldn't quite lock into an idea. Um, I had a number of book proposals that I started and abandoned and just couldn't figure out what was the right theme. And my literary agent, Tanya McKinnon, was like, "You need to write about Black single motherhood." And I was hesitant at first. I always felt like if I wrote a book about being a single mother, I'd be a single mother forever, that I was dooming
Mm,
myself somehow, and that wasn't something that I wanted. But, finally, a couple years ago, I realized that that was the book that was needed, and that was the book that I was best suited to write.
yeah, absolutely. I love how you talk about it being like stuck in this sort of like, at least in the reader's mind or audience's mind, as a single mother forever. And that's not necessarily what you wanted. Why do you think audiences do that where they're just like, because we see this with all sorts of things, or like, it could be an actor who's played a character, like you're going to be that character forever. Why do you think we don't allow the folks that we're engaging to evolve in that sort of way? Because, this is maybe a snapshot of your life, but it's not necessarily your whole life.
Yeah, I think, it's easy to put people in boxes, and I think for a lot of people, single motherhood is thought of as this box, this kind of narrow set of experiences and identity. And it's not that at all. It's multifaceted, it's rich. There's so much to me aside from the fact that I'm a single mother. And,
Hmm.
that's the case for other single mothers. And so that's what I hope this book really does, that it shows people just how diverse and multifaceted we truly are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I've noticed about your writing is it's very attention grabbing. Whenever I see, like, I remember like in like the blog era, or when I was on Twitter, if I saw that you written an essay, it's like, okay, I want to see what you're talking about. It's that attention grabbing. What has your career taught you about the power of your voice and your relationship with your audience?
That people want to feel seen and heard. I think my greatest success as a writer has been in capturing Black women's experiences in a way that people can understand and relate to, even if they're not their own. I've just tried to sometimes take complicated, difficult concepts and make them readable. Most Americans read at a sixth grade level. So
Right.
I don't use a lot of SAT words. I try to be relatable. I try to be readable. I try to be digestible.
I hear that. And I'm anticipating that with this book from what I've seen about it so far is that you're weaving in that relatable aspect through first person testimonials, but you're still giving us personal essays. You have cultural, historical analysis. What do you hope that each element, making sure that, yes, it's relatable, but you're still giving us something that can educate us and uplift us? Like, what do you hope each element brings to us as your readers?
I hope that the historical and cultural context helps people to understand some of the flaws with how we collectively understand and even experience Black single motherhood. I hope that, by sharing my own story, which I do in the first, I'm sorry, my cat is making an
So,
appearance.
Kat just wants to say what's up and show some love. It's okay.
But, the first half of the book are essays about my own experiences, and that's where I, do the cultural historical analysis, and I reflect on, how I came to understand Black single motherhood as the child of a Black single mother and what I learned about Black single motherhood from television and, community conversation and what I didn't learn, and then my own journey into becoming a Black single mom. And then and I hope that by sharing my own story, I help people feel sane, I hope
Mhm.
that people feel validated and, understand that this can happen to anyone. It's not a death sentence, it's not a punishment. Anyone can end up a single parent. And then with the second half of the book, which are as told tos with
Mhm.
21 other Black single moms, I hope that people are able to reflect on some of the commonalities in their experiences and reflect on some of the ways that they're unique. And, that there's just a greater understanding of the humanity of Black single moms.
Yeah. I love that you say it that way because from the time I started researching and thinking about this conversation, I kept thinking about the work that you're doing that I do believe is very restorative work and contrasting it with some of the language, particularly for some reason, I kept thinking about the language from the 80s of like, Reagan era, talking about like welfare queens and all the sort of stigmas that were placed on impoverished Black women who were doing their best in circumstances that were just really difficult. So I think there's a lot of power to being able to turn the narrative and say, like, see our full humanity. Don't just put us in these boxes. Don't just see us as the limited beings that you want to try to label us as.
Absolutely.
Sure. So thinking about in your work this overtone and undertone of Black feminist critique, who are those writers and thinkers that inspired you, that helped you to shape your perspective on your own journey of thinking about yourself in this world and just engaging with the world around you as a Black feminist?
Yeah, I think one of the first I don't know if I read Bell Hooks first or John
Mhm.
Morgan, but John Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost came out
Yeah.
in, I want to say 97 or 98 when I was in 8th grade. And I read about it in the source and I marked my calendar. And it was just so refreshing, even at that young age, to hear a woman talking about the ways that women and girls were, Black women and girls were treated, not just in broader society, but within the Black community,
Right.
and that we have this complicated relationship to our men and boys that has largely been ignored by the mainstream. I would go on to read Bell Hooks, who definitely is part of my foundational thinking as a feminist. Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman,
Hmm.
which was a very controversial, ahead of its time book
Yeah.
that came out in the early '80s, and I got to write the anniversary for it some years ago. Melissa Harris Perry's Sister
Hmm.
Citizen, and really framing how we understand how Black women have existed as citizens of the United States. And Treva Lindsay, who's an amazing scholar who wrote a book, came out 2 years ago called America Goddamn, and it's
Hmm.
about Black women and girls' experiences in America. I cite all of those women. I don't think I cite Michelle Wallace, but I do cite, everyone else in the book.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just something I think about, especially in this time where I saw one of the latest jobs reports that there's about like 300,000 sisters who are out of the job market since the
Mhm.
beginning of this year, and knowing alongside that sisters are the most educated group of people in this country currently. Like no one's seeking more degrees than Black women. Just thinking about that sort of society we live in that's so oppressive and wants to dismiss and denigrate, but then also knowing that we as just like a intraculture of Black people haven't always done our best to support and to make Black women feel safe in the space. Like where do you see us going from here, just like starting within the community and then hopefully that like affecting the rest of greater society in terms of how do we heal so much of what has been like broken and done wrong toward Black women? Like, where do we start?
We start with recognition. We start with acknowledging the problem. And, feminists have been trying to highlight the problem with how Black women and girls are treated for a long time, with varying levels of success. There is more public feminist discourse these days. These
Right.
conversations are taking place on social media. So I do think, that change, is coming,
Mhm.
and that it's possible. I've seen some shifts, in the past nearly 20 years that I've been, online and having these conversations. I've seen progress. So I think really recognition is a big piece of that. And so with this book, there's a chapter about the longest chapter in the book is about men.
Come
And it's
on.
about our experiences with men, and I talk about
Yeah.
sexual assault, I talk about street
Mhm.
harassment,
Yeah.
that Black girls start encountering at 11, 12 years old. I talk about this mythology, this pervasive mythology that Black men have it so much worse than Black women,
Mhm, mhm.
and how deeply entrenched in that mythology we are, and that
Right.
part of our ticket to salvation and to transforming our circumstances is for us to let go of that myth and to
Yeah.
realize that this isn't a contest. This isn't about who has it worse, Black men or Black women. We have it
Right.
different.
Yeah.
We have it different. But we also, when we talk about the things that Black women and girls endure, we have to talk about the fact that much of that is at the hands of Black men and boys.
Yes.
Most of us don't have white folks in our daily lives.
Right,
You know what I
right.
mean? Short of authority figures, they're not in community with us generally. So, the assaults, the domestic violence, the femicide, that's happening at
Yeah.
home.
Right.
But yeah, really, I think the biggest step is recognition. And there are men doing things like what you're doing and holding space for these conversations, and that's important, but there's a lot of opposition. The manosphere, which I also talk about a little bit in the book, is a very real thing. And there are men, Black men and boys that are being radicalized to
Yes.
believe heinous things about Black women and girls, and we have to really fight that at every turn.
What you're saying is so real. Wife and I were just watching the reboot of the King of the Hill TV show, and they have an episode where, the main characters are going into the manosphere and just trying to save his like younger brother from being radicalized with this like in-person camp. But as a former middle school and high school teacher, like I saw on a day-to-day, and as a father of two sons, I'm seeing it now as my sons are approaching middle school, just the sort of junk that's being fed to young boys, to your point of radicalizing them, and just the ways in which, brothers who are trying to live right, whether it's being a good member of the community through being a good husband or a father, brother, uncle, friend, however the relationship is, it often feels like we're working against the tide, that there's so much being fed to society that's saying that, you're supposed to view women as objects, that you're supposed to really just straight up hate women even though you're attracted to them. There's just so much junk that's being put there. And it just sometimes, as much as I love doing what I'm doing, it does feel like you're just like the one tiny boat in the ocean, just trying to
Yeah.
work your best to combat everything.
Mhm.
I even think to back to when I was taking the bus. I'm from Brooklyn originally, and I was taking the bus with my sons when they were very little. I had like a double stroller, and I remember getting onto the bus and almost getting like a standing ovation on that bus. Just like, yeah, brother,
Yeah.
you're doing a great job. This is excellent. I was like, yeah, for all y'all know, this could just be like my one day with my kids. Like, y'all don't know
Yeah.
I do this every day, And I just think about the ways that the bar is so desperately low to be a good dad, but you have to do so much as a mom, and it's still like never enough. Like, what do you do as a mother to keep out the noise in terms of everyone's opinion and unsolicited advice about motherhood?
Yeah, it's difficult. When my daughter was little, if I'd ever be out without her, people would say, "Where's the baby? Where's the
Yeah,
baby?"
yeah.
And I knew that when her dad was stepping out and moving around Brooklyn, people were not asking him, "Where's the baby?" They may say, "How's
No,
the baby?" But they're not
right.
saying, "Where's the baby?" Like
Exactly.
even to this day, and I had to really get on people. Like if she's not with me, she's with her dad.
Yeah. Like, it's
Like, why
okay.
does that's okay?
Yeah.
Like, it would never occur to people that as a single mother, my daughter's father was that active.
Yeah,
And I know he got a lot of props and people were very, I'm sure very celebratory of him. And when he walked around with the baby in the carrier, the reaction he would give
that's
versus
right.
me, but, just as mothers, you just have to block the noise out.
Mhm.
You can't take it seriously. But when you have the opportunity to correct people and challenge them, do it, So
Yeah.
after a while, I didn't just take, where's the baby? Oh, she's with her dad. I say, why are you asking me that?
Yeah, yeah.
Why are you assuming that she would be with me 24/7? Even now, it's so funny. Like, even now, people ask me, where's Naima? I'm like, she's with her father.
Right.
That's almost always the answer. We've never
Mhm.
really dealt with a lot of babysitters or things like that. So if she's not with me, she is with her dad.
Yeah, that's it, that's it. I'll tell you what I've told my wife to say to people when they ask her that question. It's like, just tell them, "Oh, the boys are latchkey kids, like, they're fine, they just know what to do, they heat up
Uh,
something in the microwave."
yeah, that's what I say. I'd be like, oh, I left her at home, left her a
That's
couple
right,
snacks.
that's
She's
right.
good.
TV's on. Should be fine. Yeah, for sure. What I've always admired about your work is just the honesty, and I think about it just coming from a background in ministry. I do think that when you're telling the truth, you're engaging in the prophetic. What's something in this book or in your writing in general that you've written that you've been like, whoa, I didn't realize I was going to be this real? Like, whether it's something that was personal, something that you're just like, oh, I'm calling out the great wrong in society, but you kind of surprised yourself with like, oh man, I'm really going here.
Well, a piece, and I quoted in the book because it's, the short of the book is the piece I'm most proud of. But I wrote an article for Vanity Fair 2 years ago about Dave Chappelle,
Mhm.
and I used him as a tool to talk about that mythology that exists in the Black community, that Black men and boys have it worse. And I called it our
Right.
version of the big lie. So I call
Mm-hmm.
it the black ass lie. It's a black ass lie.
Love it. Yeah.
And I just think it's just a really solid piece of work that, uses this beloved comedian and his work to kind of talk about how, our most noteworthy heralded men have so often had such a narrow lens on what it means to be Black, that they're only able to summon their humanity for Black, cisgendered, heterosexual men and boys.
Very true.
Like I think about Dave Chappelle doing that special in the summer of
Hmm.
2020, right? He did like a 15-minute comedy special and he
Right.
talked about police violence. And this was at the time of the Breonna Taylor uprisings. And he did not name her. He didn't name a single woman. He went back years. He talked about Trayvon Martin. He talked about Eric Garner, and could not name a single woman who had been killed by police, and nobody on his team said, "Hey, Dave, let's make sure we name a woman," right? Nobody in the room cared. It didn't
Right.
occur to anyone.
Right. That's very real. And I don't think people have considered how that sort of myopic approach really serves a greater white supremacist narrative. Because even in the ways going back to 5 years ago now, where folks would talk about families having the talk, you always see, it'd always be parents talking to their sons
Yep.
about how to deal with police, and it's never talking about the ways that women like the Sandra Bland's of the world, and I would even go so far to say the way that like Erica Garner's untimely demise, trying to take care of
Mhm.
and represent for her father, how that was deadly as well. There's, to your point, I don't think that we've done that work like thoughtfully enough in terms of how to really make sure that our liberation is comprehensive. I think that, as a member of the church and as a minister in the church, I've seen the ways that we haven't even gone beyond just that sort of cis hetero understanding of it, much less to talk about it in terms of like how women are being affected by it. It just seems like it would be a very narrow thing. And to me, that's much more about, let's just get us in first and then we can figure out
Yeah.
everything else. Or let's just get us in and then we close the door behind us, you know?
Yes. That's exactly what it's been. And like you said, when it's not just that Black women are killed by police, it's the way that we are impacted when the men in our lives, and it's not just that we're incarcerated at higher rates than other women because we are,
Right.
but when the men in our lives are engaged with law enforcement, it impacts
Mhm.
us.
Yeah.
We are the ones who are putting money on the books. We're the ones
Yes.
paying for lawyers.
Yes.
We're the ones paying for funerals, so it doesn't impact Black men independent of Black women, in addition to us having, our own tragedies and our own Sandra Bland's and our own, Breonna Taylor's. And it's interesting you mentioned this talk. I'm actually writing an article now about the Black girls equivalent of the talk.
Okay.
And it's not the police talk, but that's also a talk that we get to,
Uh-huh.
and it's a talk that my parents certainly had with me. But for Black girls, I'm realizing that our version of the talk is the street harassment talk.
Yeah. Mhm. That makes
Except for
sense.
it's not one that I don't think most parents have with their children.
Right.
Like my parents never warned me that, now that you're 11, now that you're 12, grown
Yeah.
men are going
Yeah.
to be hitting on you. No one ever
Right.
prepared me for that.
Yeah.
And I had so much shame around it. And I often took it to be my fault. It was the
Mhm.
way I dressed, I was
Right.
tall, I was busty, just all these
Yeah.
reasons. I told I was so deluded that I looked older. I really believed, from
Yeah.
12,
Right.
through high school that I
Mhm.
looked so much older than I did. When I look back at myself, I always looked exactly the age I was. I looked like a little
Right.
girl. I didn't get braces, and I needed braces very badly and didn't get them until I was 15. So I was very obviously a child in
Right.
all the
Right.
ways. And so often I would tell these men, I'm 14, I'm
Yeah.
16, I'm 12,
Yeah.
and they wouldn't care or they would be hostile or nasty. And so I don't want my daughter to be blindsided about that, and I don't want other girls to be blindsided about it. So I'm writing about it. Hopefully it'll be out in a few weeks, but it's just such an important conversation that I'm encouraging parents of, Black girls, really all girls, because i've
Yeah.
i've come, being on social media actively again after a few years, not really being too dialed in. I've been active on threads, and some of the, dialogue I've seen from white women and Latina women, lets me know that our experiences are not always as unique as, we may want to believe, and
Right.
that, very young girls are being approached by men in all communities.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's unfortunately true. I've seen it. What you're saying, Jamila, makes me think to an experience I had as working at a boarding school where I saw the uproar with the dress code of, and
Mhm.
just like that over policing of that dress code with
Yeah.
our young female students, and not enough conversation from my lens of like, how do you teach young boys whose hormones are whooping them left and right not to objectify girls? Like, it's a to me an entirely different conversation about the predatory older men, right?
Yeah.
That's a much more aggressive conversation in my opinion. I think that being able to snip it in the bud from the time that, you know, like my oldest son is 10 years old, like talking to him now
Yeah.
about how to approach a girl. Like if you like a girl and you say, hey, can I get your number or can we hang out? And she says no, like just leave her alone. Like don't bother her. And I think that there's so much of an entitlement that's wrapped up in it instead of like, dare I say, even like an ownership mindset that's wrapped up in it. Like, what do you mean you don't like me? And now I'm going to get violent. Now I'm going to
Yeah.
respond in a negative way.
Yeah, it's a conversation that parents have failed to have with boys for
Yeah.
generations,
Yeah.
So these grown entitled men, some of them that are still hollering at girls, were
Right.
never told, what too young was,
Come on.
or what it means for somebody to not be interested in you back, and that that's
Right.
okay. That you can move on from that. You don't have to berate them. You don't have to lash out at them. It doesn't have to be a personal thing you know?
That's the truth. That's the truth. So using intersectionality and cultural critique is a huge part of your writing. Why do you think helping folks understand that this isn't just happening to you, that this isn't something that's just unique to your community or your block or your own life, but that there are threads that connect us as a society. Why is that so important to the conversations that you
Because we need to better understand each other, and we need to understand that we exist in the context of all the things that happened before us and all these things happening around us, and that, our experiences are not always unique. It makes you feel better, it makes you feel seen and
Mhm.
understood to know that other people are having these experiences. I'm often surprised at how often women, even, just on social media, telling me, like, finally, somebody's saying this, or, I was going through this and I felt like I was crazy.
Yeah, yeah, that's something that just, like, deeply concerns me too, is, like, if you're just suffering in that isolation or you're being harassed or abused or oppressed and you think, "Oh, this is happening to me," sort of like how you were describing yourself as you were younger, "Oh, maybe something I did, maybe I shouldn't have worn this," or because I'm too tall or whatever the case may be, but helping people understand that it's not always their fault, and especially in cases where people are being exploited, it's not their fault. That's I really appreciate that for sure. So what do you hope that readers and the general culture gain from Black Single Mother? As you think about this book coming out, like what do you hope folks really take away from it?
I hope they have a new respect for Black single mothers,
Hmm.
a new perspective on us. I For far too long, we've been treated as the, villains in our community, that if only
Right.
Black women would close their legs, things would be so much different.
Hmm.
And Black single mothers are like the largest group of people entrusted with the care of Black children,
Yeah,
you know?
for real.
Like, I just think it's time to give us the respect and the credit that we deserve. Many of us making a way out of no way, so many of us doing this without a co-parent. I also want people to reconsider co-parenting.
Hmm.
There are oftentimes moms think they need to be the parent. They need
Yeah.
to do everything. They need to be there 24/7. My life and my daughter's life and my daughter's father's lives are, so much better because we are sharing in the raising of our child. We
Yeah.
both are putting in labor. We are both, taking out love. It's just good for all of us. And so I'm encouraging families that are in the position, to think about a more equitable division of time and labor and finances to do that. Studies show that children that are raised by parents who divide their time evenly have similar outcomes to children who are raised in two-parent households.
Awesome.
So family doesn't have to look one way. And
Right.
that's another takeaway. For years, I used to think about getting married and starting a family, even after I
Hmm.
had my daughter.
Yeah.
Like I did not think of us as a family.
Right.
We are a family. We
No
need to be
doubt.
recognized as a family, and we are the extended family includes her dad and her stepmom and her brother. But the two of us, we are a family and we're a sufficient family.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I love that you reframe it in that way because otherwise it can help add to this sense of like incompleteness and add to this sense of like not being enough where the family unit that you have is absolutely a family. It is enough for sure. So what would you say to someone, especially thinking about other Black single moms or just writers who are marginalized in another social location, who are hesitant to share their story and are just sort of nervous about telling their story and speaking their truth? What would you say to them in terms of a way to encourage them to start that journey?
I would tell them that you can save somebody's life, by telling your truth. You can help other people to feel grounded and better about who they are in the world. And you can heal yourself. It's been incredibly healing and therapeutic for me to write about some of my experiences, good, bad, or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And how can we continue to support your work and get this book when it comes out? Where should we go?
Um, well, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Threads, Instagram, and X, even though I don't really post on X, at
Yeah,
Jamilah Lemieux. The book is available for pre-order now wherever you get books. Um, I've been sharing a link to the Reparations Club in
awesome.
LA where they're selling it. But you can get it from all the major retailers. You can go to if you just search Black Single Mother book, it'll come right up.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. And friends, as always, remember the pre-orders are key. We got to do the
Yes,
pre-orders. Got to do
yes.
the pre-orders. Can't say that enough. Well, Jamila, this has been an honor. This has been such a joy. Thank you so much for being here, and to all of you watching and listening. Please, as always, make sure that you support our work by going to baddestchaplain.com and subscribing. We're also on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, any and everywhere you're getting podcasts. But this has been an honor, Jamila. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolute. Until next time, y'all, do take care.